welcome to my channel. Today's story is a journey of secrets, transformation, and a side of myself. There is a particular quality to Saturday mornings when you are 9 years old and the rest of the world hasn't woken up yet. The light comes in sideways through curtain gaps, pale and unhurried, and you can lie there in that halfway place between sleep and awareness and feel, for a few unguarded minutes, like absolutely nothing is required of you. No performance. No correction. No adjustment. Just breathing. I spent a lot of my childhood chasing that feeling, that undefended stillness, because the rest of the waking hours seemed to constantly require me to be something I hadn't quite figured out how to be. My name is Marcus. I'm 34 years old as I'm telling you this, and I'm sitting in an apartment that I've decorated deliberately, carefully, with things I genuinely love rather than things that were handed to me or expected of me. There's a print on the wall that my youngest sister helped me pick out. There's a shelf with books that have no particular genre because I stopped organizing my reading life for anyone else's approval years ago. There's a window with a good view of a street that gets loud in the afternoon and quiet after midnight, and I've come to love both states equally. I'm telling you all of this because I want you to understand where I ended up before I take you back to where I started, because the distance between those 2 points is the whole story, and the story is long, and it matters. I grew up in a house with 3 older sisters. Diane was the eldest, 7 years ahead of me, and by the time I was forming memories she was already a kind of mythological figure to me, someone whose world existed on a higher floor of the building and occasionally sent down artifacts, a broken cassette tape, a magazine with celebrity photos, the faint sound of music I wasn't supposed to know the words to. Then came Renata, 4 years older, who was the sister most like a general, organized and opinionated and deeply certain of what she liked and what she didn't, and who decided very early on that she liked having a little brother who would listen to her theories. And then there was Yolanda, just 18 months older than me, close enough in age that we were sorted into the same general category of children by everyone around us, which meant we shared everything, the back seat on long drives, the smaller bathroom, the vague expectation that we would entertain each other when the adults were busy. Yolanda and I were, without having been asked whether we wanted it, a unit. My father was a good man who worked long hours at a company that made industrial equipment, and he came home tired in the way that men of his generation came home tired, which is to say quietly and gratefully and without much left for complexity. He loved us in the particular way that men who aren't sure how to speak love tend to love, which is through presence, through showing up, through sitting in the same room even when the conversation moved too fast for him. He never said much about what he expected from me specifically as a boy, which I think was both a mercy and a complication, because the absence of explicit instruction didn't mean the absence of expectation. The expectation was simply environmental. It existed in the house like furniture. My mother, on the other hand, was a woman who had opinions about everything and the energy to express them, and she treated all 4 of us, boy and girls alike, with a kind of brisk, affectionate equal opportunity. She was not particularly sentimental about gender, not in any conscious ideological way, but in the more practical way of a woman who had too much to do to distinguish between which child should learn which skill. I learned to sew a button because she handed me a needle. My sisters learned to change a tire because she handed them a jack. There was no ceremony about it. That context matters. It means the house I grew up in was not a rigidly divided place, and yet the world outside that house absolutely was, and the distance between those 2 environments was something I would spend years negotiating. I want to tell you about the person I was before the day my sisters and I crossed a particular threshold together, because that person deserves to be understood on his own terms before the story of that day. I was a quiet child in public and a loud one in private, which I think is a combination that confuses most adults. I was bookish but not cerebral in a way that translated into conventional academic performance. I cried easily and was ashamed of it not because anyone had specifically told me crying was shameful but because I could tell from the way the world organized itself that it was considered, at minimum, inconvenient. I liked music. I liked stories. I liked sitting in the kitchen while Renata lectured me about whatever she had most recently decided was important. I liked the feeling of being in the middle of my family, surrounded, claimed, part of something larger than myself. What I also felt, from very early on, was a kind of ambient awareness that I didn't quite fit the shape of what a boy was supposed to be. I want to be careful here, because that statement means different things depending on who is reading or hearing it, and I don't want to skip ahead of the experience by labeling it prematurely with the vocabulary I have now. What I felt at 9, at 10, at 11, was not a fully formed thought. It was more like a frequency I could hear that no one else seemed to be tuned to. When boys at school talked about the things boys were supposed to want and feel, I understood the language but felt like I was translating from a foreign tongue. When my sisters talked among themselves, there was a register of emotional vocabulary that felt more natural to me, more native, even though I hadn't been invited to use it. I didn't know what to do with that. I didn't even know how to describe it. So I didn't. I filed it away in a part of myself I didn't visit often, and I got on with the business of being 9 years old. There were small incidents, the kind of thing that I didn't recognize as meaningful at the time but which memory, with its peculiar wisdom, has preserved in unusual detail. Once, during a game Yolanda and I were playing in her room, she asked me if I wanted to try on her new shoes, fancy ones she'd gotten for a cousin's birthday party, with a small heel and a buckle. She wasn't testing me or baiting me. She was just curious, the way children are curious, the way children offer things to each other without the overlay of significance that adults apply. I said no, quickly, reflexively, because I understood even then that saying yes would require an explanation I didn't have. But I remember looking at those shoes for a long moment before I said no. I remember thinking they were beautiful in a way I felt but couldn't justify. I remember the refusal sitting in my throat like something I'd swallowed incorrectly. Or there was the time in 4th grade when our class did a short production of a fairy tale, the kind of aggressively cheerful thing that elementary school teachers produce with absolute sincerity, and the parts were assigned more or less by height, which meant I ended up as a talking tree rather than the prince or the knight or anything with agency. One of the girls in my class, Priya, played the queen, and she had a costume with a long skirt that swept the floor when she walked, and she moved through that gymnasium with such complete comfort and authority that I felt something I couldn't name then and which I now recognize as a particular species of longing, not romantic, not sexual, but the longing for ease, for comfort in one's own presentation, for the sense of being exactly who you appear to be. I don't want to make it sound as though I was a child in crisis, because I wasn't. I was, for the most part, a fairly ordinary kid navigating fairly ordinary pressures, with all the normal experiences of friendship and frustration and occasional joy that childhood provides. The undercurrent I'm describing was not so much suffering as it was a kind of quiet question mark that I dragged along behind me, almost inaudible, almost invisible, but persistent. And it was into that quiet, persistent uncertainty that my sisters arrived one particular afternoon with a suggestion that would, in ways none of us could have predicted, change the entire direction of my interior life. I was 12. Diane was 19 and home for a weekend from the university program she'd just started. Renata was 16 and at the peak of her organizational powers, which that year meant she had become deeply interested in aesthetics, in how things looked, in color and proportion and the grammar of appearance. Yolanda was 13 and had recently crossed some invisible threshold of social awareness that meant she now cared about things she'd previously been indifferent to, like how she was perceived, like what she wore to school, like the difference between looking put together and looking careless. I was 12, and I was at that particular painful altitude of early adolescence where your body is starting to change in ways you didn't consent to and your understanding of yourself hasn't kept pace with the physical evidence. It was a Saturday afternoon, the kind that stretches itself long and warm in early autumn, and our parents had gone to a birthday party for one of their friends, one of those adult events that require presents but not children, and so the 4 of us had been left in the house with the instruction to not destroy anything and to eat something reasonable for dinner. Diane had taken over the living room with fashion magazines and a pot of tea. Renata had commandeered the dining room table for a project that involved fabric samples and a diagram she'd drawn on graph paper. Yolanda and I were nominally watching television but mostly talking the kind of talk you talk when you're a teenager and the conversation doesn't go anywhere specific but also goes everywhere. At some point, I don't remember the exact sequence, Renata came into the living room with an expression I recognized as the specific look she wore when she had an idea. It was a look of slight elevation, like she was standing on the inside of something the rest of us hadn't climbed into yet. She looked at me for a moment without saying anything, and then she said, in her particular deadpan way, "You should let us give you a makeover." I stared at her. Yolanda looked up from the television. Diane lowered her magazine. My first instinct, immediate and automatic, was to say no, to say it fast and dismissively the way I'd learned to deflect things that touched something too close. But before I could speak, Renata kept going, and what she said was not what I expected. She didn't say it would be fun, or funny, or that they wanted to see what I'd look like. She said, "I've been thinking about proportion and symmetry, and I think your features would photograph differently if you tried some of the things I've been learning about. I'm not talking about making you into something. I'm talking about an experiment. I want to understand contrast." This was so purely Renata, so characteristic of the way her mind worked, that it shifted the conversation before I'd even decided how to respond. Diane, who was always drawn to whatever was happening as long as it involved everyone in the same room, put down her magazine and said, "I have thoughts about this too." Yolanda said, "Can I help?" And just like that, the question had become communal, had become a project, and I was sitting in the middle of 4 people, including myself, who had different reasons for being interested in the answer. I want to pause here, because I've told this story before in my own head, told it the way you tell yourself things in the dark, and I know there's a version of this moment that could be told as comedy or as trauma or as something titillating, and I want to tell it as none of those things. I want to tell it as what it actually was, which was a moment of genuine uncertainty for me, a moment in which I was 12 years old and sitting at the intersection of several things I didn't understand about myself, and my sisters, who knew me as well as anyone, had inadvertently handed me a doorway. I didn't know yet what was behind it. I was afraid of what might be behind it. And I was, underneath the fear, curious in a way that felt almost treacherous. I said yes. I said it quietly, and with a number of conditions I immediately started listing, conditions about it not being weird, about no one outside the house ever knowing, about it being done and over before our parents came home. Renata accepted all conditions with the brisk practicality of someone who had already considered and dismissed the objections. Yolanda clapped once, then looked immediately self-conscious about having clapped. Diane said, "Let me get my kit," and disappeared upstairs with the certainty of someone who had been waiting for this sentence all day, even though she absolutely had not. What happened in the next 2 hours is something I have turned over in my mind more times than I can count, not because it was dramatic or revealing in some obvious way, but because of how internal it was, how private the real experience was even as the external performance of it was entirely visible to 3 other people. Renata did most of the organizing. She sat me at Diane's vanity mirror and explained, in the manner of a professor delivering a lecture, what she was going to do and why, framing everything in terms of her aesthetic interests rather than any statement about me personally. She talked about bone structure and skin tone and the way light fell differently on different faces. She was, I realize now, giving me the gift of a framework that asked nothing of me except to be a neutral subject, and that framework was, at the time, exactly what I needed to stay in the room. Diane applied foundation with the focus of someone doing delicate repair work, and she told me to stay still and to stop blinking so much, which I found difficult. Yolanda sat on the bed behind me and chatted the way she always chatted, filling the air with small observations and opinions, and her chatter was a kind of ground level beneath all of it, keeping the atmosphere from becoming too weighted. I was, for most of those 2 hours, trying very hard not to think about what was happening, which is of course an excellent way to think about nothing else. And then Renata said, "Okay, look," and I looked in the mirror. I have spent a great deal of time since that afternoon trying to accurately describe what I felt in that moment, and I always come back to the same inadequacy of language. What I felt was not what I expected to feel. I had expected, I think, to feel ridiculous, or wrong, or caught at something, or to feel some variety of the discomfort I'd been bracing myself against. What I actually felt was something quieter and stranger than any of those things. What I felt was recognition. Not recognition of beauty, not a sense that I was looking at something that ought to be preserved or repeated. Not vanity, not performance, not anything external. Recognition as in the sense of seeing something that had been there all along, something interior that I'd never been able to locate precisely, and for a moment it had a face, and the face was mine, but arranged differently, presented differently, with different rules applying to it. It was like hearing a sentence you've always thought in a language you didn't know you knew. I didn't say any of this. I said, "That's wild," in a voice I kept deliberately flat. My sisters made various sounds of satisfaction. Renata took several photographs for her project. Diane made adjustments I didn't fully follow. Yolanda said I looked like a girl from a music video, which was meant as a compliment and which I received as a compliment and which also sat in my chest for hours afterward like a small, unexploded thing. We cleaned everything up, returned the room to its state before, and by the time my parents came home, there was no evidence of what had happened. Dinner happened. Television happened. Bedtime happened. And I lay in my room that night with the lights off, staring at the ceiling, trying to figure out what had happened to me, not in the room with my sisters, but in the mirror, in that 2-second moment of recognition, in the completely private and unshared experience that had somehow occurred in a room with 3 other people. The thing about that night is that it was the first time in my life I had to actively decide what something meant. Before that, I had been able to get through most of my confusion by deferring to ambiguity, by leaving things unlabeled, by moving forward without looking at the mechanism of what moved me. But that moment in the mirror was too specific for deferral. It had happened. It had felt a specific way. And I was 12 years old, alone in the dark, with a brain that wasn't equipped to process it and a social world that would have offered me nothing useful if I'd tried to bring it there. So I did what people do with things they can't process. I put it somewhere. I built a small, solid room around it and I left it there, and I told myself that what it meant was nothing, that it was a game my sisters and I had played, that the feeling I'd had was curiosity or novelty or the particular receptive state of a child with too much imagination. I told myself these things with confidence, and they worked for a while, and the while was approximately 4 years. I want to tell you about those 4 years, because they were not nothing. They were not simply waiting time, not simply the space between the first incident and the next significant development. They were years in which I was actively constructing an identity, the way all teenagers construct identities, clumsily and urgently, building outward from the inside with whatever materials the environment provided. I made friends. I discovered I was reasonably good at writing, specifically at putting into words the emotional weight of experiences that resisted easy description. I joined the school paper. I had arguments with my father about music that were really arguments about autonomy. I had a phase of very deliberate, performed toughness that lasted about 8 months and convinced no one, least of all me. I dated, or tried to, in the halting way of someone who is doing a thing they've been told to do without being entirely certain they want to do it. I had a girlfriend for 4 months when I was 14, a kind and funny girl named Simone who I genuinely liked and who I think also genuinely liked me, and the relationship ended not because of anything dramatic but because neither of us was quite sure what we were doing or why, and at some point that uncertainty became louder than the affection. I look back on that relationship with real warmth. She was good to me. I was good to her. We were just both slightly lost in adjacent but different ways. What I noticed about myself during these years, the thing I was carefully not thinking about directly, was that I continued to have a particular relationship with certain kinds of experience that other boys my age didn't seem to share. I was affected by things they moved past. I cared about things they categorized as irrelevant. I had a capacity for empathy that I'd learned to hide because it read in my social environment as weakness, and hiding it required a continuous, low-grade expenditure of energy that I didn't fully account for until much later, when I stopped and the relief was enormous. I also, and this is the part one kept most carefully in that locked room, found myself occasionally, late at night or in quiet unobserved moments, circling back to the question of who I was underneath the construction. Not the Marcus I was building for public consumption, not the Marcus I brought to school or to family dinners or to the various contexts that required me to perform appropriateness. The Marcus that was still sitting in front of that mirror at 12, looking at something he recognized and couldn't name. By the time I was 16, the room I'd built around that experience was showing structural stress. Not dramatic stress, not the kind of thing that appears in movies as a crisis, but the kind of quiet deterioration that happens when you ask a temporary solution to do permanent work. I wasn't unhappy in any way I could have articulated to a doctor or a school counselor. I was functional, social, reasonably engaged with the world. But I was also increasingly aware of a sort of doubling in my experience, a sense that I was moving through my life on the surface while something else, something I hadn't named and hadn't dealt with, continued to move in a separate register beneath. It was Renata, of all people, who first gave me language for what that might be. Renata was 20 by then, at university, studying something that involved as much psychology as it did design, and she had the particular quality of people who've recently encountered ideas that have rearranged their understanding of themselves and others. She was incandescent with it, eager to share the reorganization, to offer the new map to everyone she loved. She came home for a holiday weekend, and we ended up talking late in the kitchen the way she and I always talked, at a table with cups of something hot, the house quiet around us, and at some point she said, unprompted, "I've been thinking about that Saturday when we did your makeup. When you were 12. I remember the temperature of the room seeming to change, which is obviously not a physical fact, but which is the most accurate description of the internal experience." I kept my voice very neutral. I said, "What about it?" She said, "I think I was thoughtless. Not cruel, not intentional, but thoughtless. I turned it into my project. My interests. And I've been wondering whether you ever got to figure out what it meant for you." I didn't answer for what felt like a very long time. And then I said, "I don't know what it means." Renata, who was at her best when she had to think carefully about something, looked at me for a moment and said, "That's actually the most honest thing I've heard anyone say about themselves in a long time." We talked for 3 hours. Not about conclusions, not about answers, but about questions, about the way identity is constructed and assumed and challenged, about gender as performance and as internal experience, about the difference between what you feel and what it means and why those two things aren't always in easy alignment. Renata wasn't telling me who I was. She was, for the first time in my life, offering me a conversation about the question that I didn't have to have alone. I want to be honest about the complexity of what followed, because simplifying it would do a disservice to the reality of it. Following that conversation, I went through a period, roughly my late adolescence through my early 20s, that was the most turbulent of my life, not because anything catastrophic happened but because I was doing, at enormous internal cost, the work of genuinely examining myself. I was trying to understand what the feelings I'd been housing for years actually meant, what category they belonged to, what they asked of me. And this was difficult in a way that is hard to explain to someone who hasn't done it, because it's not dramatic work in the external sense. You can do it while appearing completely ordinary. You can be failing at it spectacularly while sitting perfectly still in a lecture hall or having a normal conversation with a friend. The work is entirely interior, which makes it, in some ways, the most isolating work there is. I want to be precise about what I was and wasn't questioning, because I think precision matters here for people who might recognize something of themselves in this story. I was not, or not primarily, questioning my sexual orientation, though that question was inevitably part of the larger examination. What I was most centrally questioning was something harder to name and less culturally legible. I was questioning the relationship between my inner sense of self and the gender identity that had been assigned to me at birth and that I had been, without much conscious examination, inhabiting as a set of inherited expectations rather than as a genuine internal reality. I was asking whether the Marcus who showed up every day was the product of actual self-understanding or the product of a performance that had been requested of me before I was old enough to consent to it. These are not comfortable questions. They don't arrive politely and wait for a convenient time. They interrupt sleep and concentration and the experience of being with people you love. They make everything that previously felt stable feel provisional. I found myself in a period of deep and uncomfortable uncertainty that lasted, with varying intensity, for several years, and during which I was not always well, not always kind to myself, not always honest with the people who cared about me. I was 18 when I first, entirely alone, deliberately chose to dress in a way that was not conventionally male. I was living, briefly, in a studio apartment between school terms, subletting from a friend of Diane's, and one afternoon I bought, from a secondhand shop, a dress, a plain one, nothing dramatic, a dark green cotton dress that cost me $4. I brought it home. I tried it on. I stood in the bathroom mirror of this tiny apartment that wasn't mine and I looked at myself for a long time. I want to be very clear about what happened in that bathroom, because it would be easy, and it would be dishonest, to describe it as revelation or liberation or any of the triumphant words that tend to populate these moments in stories told for consumption. What actually happened was that I stood there and felt, first, very afraid, and then, underneath the fear, very sad, and then, underneath the sadness, something that I can only describe as a kind of relief that also felt like grief. which is a combination of feelings that is not really supposed to be possible, but which anyone who has ever confronted a truth they've been avoiding will recognize immediately. The relief was about finally being in the room with the question rather than outside it. The grief was about all the years I'd spent pretending the room wasn't there, all the energy I'd spent in misdirection, all the conversations I hadn't had, all the moments I'd dismissed rather than allowed. And underneath both of those things was something quieter still, a kind of orientation, a sense of being pointed in a direction that I didn't fully understand but which felt, for the first time in years, like my own. I want to tell you about the shame, because it would be dishonest to leave it out, and because I think shame is one of the most universally underestimated forces in a person's life. Shame isn't just an unpleasant feeling. Shame is a whole architecture. It determines what you allow yourself to think about, what you allow yourself to want, what you allow yourself to explore, whose approval you seek and at what cost. The shame I was carrying about this aspect of my experience was not something I had chosen or generated. It was something I had absorbed from an environment that had very clear and clearly communicated ideas about what men were supposed to do, want, feel, and wear, and it had gotten into me the way damp gets into walls, not through a single dramatic incident but through accumulated small exposures until the structure of my self-understanding was saturated with it. That shame lived in me as a voice that sounded, humiliatingly, almost exactly like mine, and it said things like, "This is pathetic, this is weak, this is evidence of something broken in you, this is something normal people don't feel, this is a thing that has to stay in the smallest, most locked-away room you can find." And that voice was persuasive not because it was accurate but because it spoke in the first person and because I had never given myself the tools to argue back with it effectively. The process of learning to argue back was slow and non-linear and required, eventually, help that I was reluctant for a long time to ask for. I was 22 when I first saw a therapist, a decision I made after a period of about 8 months during which I was, in retrospect, not doing well in the ways that matter. I was sleeping badly. I was drinking more than was good for me. I was avoiding the people I loved, specifically because they knew me well enough that being around them required a level of authenticity I wasn't prepared to maintain. I was going through the motions of a life that felt, at an increasing distance, like a suit of clothes that belonged to someone else. My therapist was a man in his 50s named Dr. Okafor, and he had the gift, rare and invaluable, of listening in a way that made you feel not merely heard but metabolized, as though what you said entered him and was considered at some depth before the response came back. I didn't tell him anything of substance for the first 3 months of weekly sessions. I talked around it with a thoroughness and creativity that, looking back, I am genuinely impressed by. I invented adjacent concerns. I performed introspection on topics that were real but not central. I was, as people in therapy often are, giving the performance of engagement while carefully keeping the subject outside the room. The thing that broke that open was not a dramatic question from Dr. Okafor and not a dramatic moment of my own confession. It was, of all things, a dream. I dreamed I was at a family dinner, the kind my mother organized on holidays, the whole house full and the kitchen smelling of the food that had been cooking all day, and everyone was there, my parents, my sisters, their partners and friends, and I was sitting at the table and I was wearing something bright and soft and entirely unlike the clothes I wore in waking life, and no one at the table was reacting to it at all, not with commentary or judgment or concern, just talking and eating and passing dishes, and in the dream I felt so completely at ease that waking up was an actual physical loss, the kind you feel in your sternum. I told Dr. Okafor about the dream, not as a confession but almost casually, the way you offer a therapist a small piece of the interior landscape when you trust them enough to let them look. And he didn't turn it into a diagnosis or an event. He asked me how I felt when I woke up. I said I felt like I'd lost something. He asked me what I thought I'd lost. I said I didn't know. He said, "I think you do." And in the silence that followed that sentence, which lasted long enough that I was aware of the traffic outside and the air conditioning and my own heartbeat, I said out loud, for the first time in my life, the thing I'd been keeping in that locked room for 10 years. I said that I'd never felt as comfortable in myself as I felt in that dream. That there was a version of me that I kept entirely private, that I'd never allowed out of a small controlled space, that had to do with how I experienced gender, how I related to femininity, how I felt in certain clothes, certain presentations, certain mirrors. That I didn't know what it meant. That I was terrified of what it meant. That I had been carrying the weight of not knowing and the weight of the terror simultaneously, and that I was tired of doing both. Dr. Okafor let me finish. He sat with it for a moment. And then he said, "How does it feel to have said that?" I said it felt like I'd put down something very heavy that I'd been carrying for so long I'd stopped noticing the weight. He said, "That's usually what telling the truth feels like." I want to be honest about the years that followed, because they were not a clean arc of progress. There is no version of this kind of personal work that goes in a straight line. What happened over the next several years was more like a series of spirals, each one moving towards some deeper understanding but also circling back through territory I thought I'd already resolved. There were periods of clarity and periods of deep confusion. There were conversations with my sisters that were transformative and conversations with friends that were disastrous. There were relationships that ended, at least partly, because I was not yet capable of the kind of honest intimacy that requires you to bring your full self into the room. There were periods of self-acceptance that then collapsed back into shame under the pressure of some new social encounter or some new internal voice that recycled old accusations. I came out to my sisters first, if coming out is even the right language for what I was doing, which was less announcing an identity and more sharing a long-kept experience. Yolanda, who had spent our whole lives in such close proximity to me that she seemed to already have a file prepared for the information, absorbed it with a combination of love and unsurprise that made me cry in a way I hadn't cried since childhood. She said, "I know you've been carrying something. I'm glad you told me." She didn't ask for explanations or categories. She just held the moment with me in a way that I will be grateful for as long as I live. Renata, characteristically, had thoughts. Not critical thoughts, but real ones, the kind that took the information seriously and turned it over and examined it from multiple angles. She asked questions I hadn't asked myself yet. She asked about the difference between how I felt about gender expression, the clothes and presentation, and how I felt about gender identity, the more interior, fundamental question of who I was. She asked whether I'd been able to distinguish those two things or whether they blurred together. She asked what support would look like, practically. She was, as she had always been, more useful to me as someone who thought alongside me than someone who simply accepted me, because acceptance without engagement had never been what I needed from her. I needed her to take it seriously, and she did. Diane, who had always been the one most likely to respond to significant information by doing something practical, invited me to spend a weekend with her in the city where she lived, and we spent 2 days wandering through neighborhoods and talking and not talking and eating things we didn't need and going to an art exhibition about identity and self-portraiture that she picked specifically for the occasion and that I found so genuinely moving I had to pretend the lighting was bad when I started to get emotional. She said, "At the end of the weekend, you've always been you. This isn't new information. It's just information you're finally sharing." And then she said, "Also, your color is definitely emerald, not forest green, which you've been getting wrong for years," and we both laughed so hard I had to sit down on a street corner, and that laughter was itself a kind of homecoming. Coming out to my parents was different. I want to tell you about it truthfully, which means telling you that it did not go perfectly. My father, who had spent 30 years operating within a set of cultural and generational assumptions about what sons were supposed to be and do and feel, needed time. He didn't say anything harmful. He didn't reject me or become cold. But he also couldn't immediately summon the language of acceptance, because the language had simply never been part of his equipment, and I had to sit with the silence of his working through it, which was uncomfortable in a way that was also, with time, deeply human and even kind. My mother, predictably, had thoughts and feelings and expressed both simultaneously at considerable volume. Her response was a mixture of concern, confusion, love, and the particular maternal species of guilt that says, "Did I do something that caused this?" and which I had to address gently and firmly by explaining, as many times as was necessary, that there is nothing to have caused, that this is not a condition, that my experience of my own identity is not the result of a mistake. She needed to do her own processing, her own reading, her own conversations with people she trusted, and I gave her the time and space to do that, and the time and space were worth giving. What emerged, over months and eventually years, was something I had not allowed myself to expect, a real, unglamorous, imperfect, but genuine recalibration of the family's relationship with who I was. My father started asking questions, not comfortable questions, clumsy ones, the kind that revealed how much he didn't know, and I learned to receive those questions as evidence of effort rather than as insults. My mother became, with characteristic thoroughness, more informed than most people I knew about gender identity research, which both touched me and occasionally made me feel like a thesis topic, but her intentions were love, and love in imperfect vessels is still love. My sisters formed the inner circle of my support and my sanity and the continuity of who I was before and who I was becoming, because they had been there, in that room, at that vanity mirror, on that Saturday afternoon when I was 12 years old, and they had seen something before I was ready to see it myself. I want to spend some time talking about what this exploration actually involved in practical, lived terms, because I think the gap between how these experiences are represented in popular culture and what they are actually like deserves attention. Crossdressing, as a practice, as part of someone's personal exploration of gender identity or expression, is in most cases an entirely private, quiet, interior experience, not a performance, not a statement, not anything that asks anything of anyone except the person doing it. For me, in the years that I was working through my understanding of myself, it was a form of self-examination, a way of being in my own presence on my own terms, of testing what felt authentic and what didn't, of gathering, slowly and carefully, an understanding of the relationship between my inner life and my outer presentation. It was not easy. I want to say that clearly. It was not the liberated, joyful experience that certain narratives present as the natural result of self-discovery. Those narratives are real for some people, and I'm glad for them, but my experience was more complicated, more laden, more incremental than that. There were moments of genuine peace and even pleasure in the exploration, moments when I felt a particular alignment between inside and outside that I hadn't felt before. But there were also moments of profound doubt, of wondering whether what I was doing was authentic self-exploration or something else, something compensatory or avoidant or confused. There were moments of self-consciousness so acute they were almost physical. There were moments of internalized criticism so loud I couldn't hear anything else. What I learned, through therapy and through time and through the slow accumulation of experience, is that doubt and authenticity are not opposites. You can be genuinely in the process of discovering something true about yourself and also be deeply uncertain about what it means. Those two things can coexist, and learning to let them coexist without resolving the tension prematurely, without forcing a definitive label before the exploration has matured enough to support one, is itself an act of considerable emotional intelligence. I didn't always manage it. But I learned to try. I also learned, and this took longer, that the exploration of gender expression, the way I dressed, the way I moved through the world, the way I related to different aspects of my own presentation, did not need to resolve into a single identity category in order to be meaningful or valid. I am not going to tell you what my identity is, not because I'm hiding it but because the point of this story is not the destination. The point is the journey, and specifically the journey of learning to take yourself seriously enough to make the trip at all. What I will tell you is that by my late 20s I had reached a place of relationship with myself that felt substantially different from where I'd been at 12, at 16, at 20. It wasn't resolution in the sense of having answered every question. It was resolution in the sense of having made peace with the questions, having decided that my experience was worth taking seriously, having chosen the ongoing project of self-knowledge over the comfort of settled self-ignorance. I want to tell you about the social dimension of this, because it's the dimension that carries the most external weight and the most practical consequence. The world, as it is currently organized, does not extend equal courtesy and safety to all people who exist outside conventional gender expression. That's a fact. It's a fact I encountered at various points in my late teens and 20s in forms that ranged from mild to genuinely frightening, from the small daily experience of navigating looks and comments that told me my existence was considered unusual or amusing or threatening, to more specific encounters that I don't need to detail here but which left marks. I want to say something to anyone who is reading or hearing this and who has had similar experiences, who has faced the external world's reaction to the internal reality of who they are. The world's confusion about you is not evidence of your wrongness. Other people's discomfort with your complexity is not a verdict on your value. The fact that a particular expression of identity doesn't fit neatly into the categories that culture has prepared for it does not make it less real, less valid, or less worthy of the same respect and dignity that more legible identities receive. It means the categories need to be larger. That's a problem with the categories, not with the person. I also want to say, because I think it matters, that the navigation of this reality involves real choices and real judgment. Being authentic about who you are does not mean being incautious. Knowing your context, reading your environment, making practical decisions about when and where and how to bring your full self into a situation, these are not acts of cowardice. They are acts of wisdom. There is a difference between hiding who you are out of shame and strategically managing self-disclosure out of self-protection, and that difference matters, and learning to tell the difference is part of the work. I'm now in my early 30s and I live in a city that is, by the standards of the world, relatively tolerant, and I have built a life and a social world that can contain more of me than any environment I inhabited before it. I have relationships, friendships, professional associations, that are built on a more complete version of who I am than I had available to offer at 22. I have, I think, become someone who is genuinely more present in his own life, more conscious of the gap between performance and being, less willing to spend the energy of sustained pretense. I dress, in the privacy of my own home and occasionally in public spaces where it feels safe and appropriate, in ways that reflect the full range of my relationship with my own presentation. Some days that looks conventional by any external standard. Some days it doesn't. Both are me. Neither is the mask. That's the thing I want to underscore, because I think it's the part of the journey that took the longest to reach and that feels most important to communicate. The goal of the exploration was not to arrive at some new fixed identity that would replace the old performance. The goal was to stop performing and to start actually being. And what I found, when I stopped performing, was not a single simplified answer. It was a more honest complexity. It was a self that included more, not less. It was a life that felt more like mine. I think about my sisters often in this context, about the specific texture of what they gave me and what they didn't. They gave me, on a Saturday afternoon when I was 12, an accidental doorway. They gave me, in conversations over many years, the particular gift of being taken seriously, of having my experience approached with genuine interest rather than either dismissal or excessive drama. They gave me, in their various ways, the experience of being loved across a change, of having people who knew me before and after the exploration and who didn't treat the after version as a replacement or a correction but as a continuation. That is not a small gift. That is, for a lot of people navigating similar territory, exactly the gift that would make the difference between surviving the journey and not. But they also, without meaning to and without malice, gave me something harder to name and less comfortable to acknowledge. They gave me my first experience of having my identity become someone else's project before I understood it as my own. Renata framed that afternoon as her aesthetic experiment. Diane brought her kit with the certainty of someone performing a service. Yolanda clapped. They were kind, they were well-intentioned, they were, by any reasonable standard, great sisters in that moment. And also, at 12, I was handed a mirror before I decided whether I wanted to look, and the experience of what I saw in that mirror became entangled, for years, with the experience of being seen, of being made into something by other people's interest rather than arrived at by my own internal journey. The disentangling of those two things, the reflection they gave me and the reflection I found for myself, took a long time, and it was necessary, and I think it's important to name it. I'm not saying my sisters did anything wrong. They didn't. I'm saying that the people who love us can give us our first glimpses of things that we then have to go back and find on our own terms, and the finding on your own terms is not optional if what you're looking for is genuine self-knowledge rather than an image constructed by the loving attention of others. This is true in every domain of identity, not only in the specific territory I've been navigating. The people who first name our qualities, who first see and reflect back our possibilities, who first hand us the mirror, do us a service and set us a task simultaneously. The service is the beginning. The task is the rest of our lives. I've been thinking, in the preparation of sharing this story, about what I most want you to take from it, whoever you are, whatever age you are, whatever your particular relationship to the questions I've been exploring. I don't want you to take from it any particular conclusion about gender, identity, expression, or category. Those are your questions to sit with in your own time. What I want you to take, if anything at all, is something about the quality of the relationship with yourself that the examination requires. Self-knowledge is not comfortable. It is the most important work you will do in your life, and it is uncomfortable in proportion to how seriously you take it. The discomfort is not a signal to stop. It is a signal that you are in genuine proximity to something real. The voice that tells you your experience isn't worth examining, that it's weird or wrong or inconvenient or unfitting or something to be kept in a small locked room and never brought into the light, that voice is not your protector. It is your limitation. It is the architecture of shame that was built before you were old enough to object, and it has limited your access to yourself, and you have the absolute right to knock it down. You also have the right, and I mean this as seriously as anything else I've said, to take your time. There is no correct pace for self-discovery. There is no deadline by which you must have arrived at a settled understanding of who you are. 34-year-old me is still in the process. I expect 44-year-old me will still be in the process. The process is not a failure of completion. It is a description of a life lived with genuine attention. The other thing I want you to take, if you are someone who loves a person navigating this kind of territory, whether that person is a sibling or a partner or a child or a friend, is this: what they need from you more than any specific response is the experience of being taken seriously. Not agreed with necessarily, not immediately understood, not smoothly accommodated, but taken seriously. The experience of having the complexity of who you are met with genuine attention rather than dismissal or excessive drama or the transformation of your identity into someone else's project. That is the thing my sisters gave me, imperfectly and incrementally and with considerable love, and it made a difference that I cannot overstate. I'm aware that this story has a particular quality of confession about it, and I want to address that directly, because I think the word confession carries implications I don't intend. This is not a confession. I have nothing to confess. What I've described is a life, a real one, with the kind of texture and difficulty and occasional grace that real lives have, and the decision to share it publicly comes not from the desire to confess, but from the hope that someone, somewhere, who is sitting in the dark with their own version of the locked room and the unasked question, will hear in this an echo of their own experience, will feel slightly less alone in the navigation, will feel slightly more permission to take themselves seriously. If that person is you, I want to say, I see you. Not in the sense of having access to the specific content of your experience, but in the sense of recognizing the shape of it, the particular loneliness and effort of carrying a question that the world around you hasn't provided good tools for answering. I recognize the cost of the pretense and the cost of the examination both. I recognize the specific difficulty of doing identity work in a culture that treats identity as a fixed and simple thing rather than the ongoing, demanding, rewarding project that it actually is. I want to end where I began, in the apartment with the print on the wall and the shelf of unsorted books and the window with the good view. I chose everything in this apartment. I know why I chose it. I know what it says about who I am and what I value and how I understand my own place in the world. That might sound like a small thing. I promise you it isn't. For years I moved through spaces that felt like they belonged to someone else's idea of who I should be. Getting to a place where the environment of your life reflects a genuine interior, where the outside and inside are at least in honest conversation with each other, is the result of enormous effort, tremendous difficulty, considerable help from people I love, and a willingness to take yourself seriously enough to keep looking even when the looking is hard. My sisters were the first to hand me the mirror. I'm the one who had to learn to look. I'm the one who had to decide what I saw was worth knowing. I'm the one who had to build, slowly and imperfectly, the life in which what I saw could live. And I'm the one who is here, now, 34 years old, sitting in an apartment I chose, telling you this story because I believe it is worth telling, because I believe you are worth the honesty, and because I believe that stories about the difficult, unglamorous, real work of knowing yourself are exactly the stories that are most needed in a world that prefers the clean arc of transformation to the complicated, continuing, deeply human work of becoming. Thank you for watching and spending this time with me. If this story helped you understand yourself or others a little better, feel free to explore more on the channel.